When I started my doctoral studies, I took a course a couple of courses actually, in urban politics, and decided that that's where I wanted to focus my dissertation. Then I was in New York, or I had moved to New York for personal reasons, and it was just the moment when there was a movement for community control of schools in New York. So that seemed a perfect opportunity to focus on that topic. But my original idea was, well, I would see what was the effect of the change in the governance of schools on the outcomes of schools, whether community participation would lead to better results. I had also, by the way, taken a course in education politics with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who at that time was teaching at the Ed School at Harvard. So I started sitting in on meetings of parents who were concerned about the schools. I quickly realized that this wasn't an administrative issue or a governance issue per se. It was really about a social movement. So I began to read up on the literature on social movements. It became, my dissertation was on the movement for community control. Then eventually, in collaboration with my husband Norman, we did a book called Urban Political Movements. He had also looked at a parents' movement in a particular school. So we were very sympathetic with these parents, that they were battling a bureaucracy that was very rigid. So I became very pro public participation. However, that's one of the ways in which I've changed a lot, because over the years, and I've studied citizen participation in many different venues and interviewed many people who were participants, I saw that the movement, which started out as a movement primarily of low-income people, of people who were mainly minorities attempting to gain power within urban governments, that eventually citizen participation became a predominantly middle-class movement, became oriented either towards environmentalism, or a lot of it was just plain NIMBYism, especially keeping out low-income people. So I've become much more skeptical about community participation. I think we have to judge the substance of what people want, not simply the process. I've become increasingly focused on the relationship between processes and outcomes, and the way in which a particular process under certain circumstances or within particular contexts can result in outcomes that favor one interest group or another. So I think we can never think of ideal processes without always thinking about what they're going to produce. Yeah, well, I'd always been, and since I was an undergraduate, really influenced by Marxist thought in terms of critical theory and the way in which we should always approach any situation with a critique, with attempting to get through the surfaces down beneath. I was certainly influenced by David Harvey, but also by reading political theory, really as an undergraduate, as much as a graduate. In particular, when I was a graduate student, I studied with, although my PhD was at MIT, I took courses at Harvard. I took a course with Louis Hartz, who was perhaps the strongest influence I've ever had in terms of how to think. He was very much a dialectician. He always saw currents of thought in relation to others. I stumbled into teaching planning. I hadn't really expected to, but I fit very well into planning because I've always been so concerned with questions of what to do rather than simply of process, and political scientists focus so much on process. But teaching planners, I quickly realized that Marxist thought wasn't going to do much in terms of the here and now of planning. One of the earliest articles I wrote was called New Debates in Urban Planning, the Impact of Marxist Ideas in America, which I wrote with Norman, my husband. And what we basically argued was that Marxist thought led you to critique, but by itself it didn't lead you to what to do. And in particular, if we're talking about planners, they have to do something in the short run. They can't wait around till a revolution. I also think that I never really believed in revolutionary Marxism, and I believe in it even less now, because I look around the world and I do not see that revolution has produced very good outcomes. So I've always been in a certain way conservative. Now, David Harvey has been a major influence on my thinking. I think he's probably the most brilliant person who's still alive that I know. And he has incredible insights, but he always ends up, after he identifies a problem and critiques extremely well and sees all the ways in which capitalism biases outcomes, but then he turns to Marxism the way Christians turn to the Bible, and he suddenly says, well, the answer to all these problems is in Marx, if we look for it enough in Marx. I don't think that Marx, who was writing, after all, in the period of the rise of, well, the Industrial Revolution and the development of a proletariat based in manufacturing, has that much to tell us in terms of how to deal with contemporary cities, the divisions that now exist among the educated and the less educated, and particularly he just thought that nationalisms were going to disappear, that capitalism would sweep those kinds of differences away, and instead we see the strength of identity politics, the way in which divisions are not along class lines necessarily at all, even though class and race and ethnicity are closely related, so that there's a lot of other kinds of literature to look at when you're concerned with issues of diversity. Iris Marion Young's thought on groups and the way in which groups tend to identify with each other, even across class boundaries, has been very important. I actually knew Iris, not well, but knew her before she died. She was a philosopher, a theorist, but she also taught in a planning program. So she was quite aware of the kinds of issues that planners faced, and I think therefore was very unusual among political philosophers. Well, given that we now see national governments, which have become so chauvinistic and exclusionary, that I think the only place that there are progressive movements are at the urban level or at the subnational level. There are things that can be done in cities. We've seen in the United States, for example, the move for minimum wage or fight for 15, based in cities and pushing for municipal ordinances or sometimes state ones, but that it's at the level of subnational government that progressive movements are having any success. I also think that, and this has to do, I guess, with the Trump administration, that even while the national administration at the top is politically retrograde, that people within bureaucratic structures are actually opposing it and wherever they can sabotaging it. Many years ago, I read a book called Gorillas in the Bureaucracy. I suppose it was 30, 40 years ago. And one of the things it showed was the way that people who had bureaucratic positions could, in fact, fight for progressive ends. Weber long ago argued that bureaucrats were powerful in relationship to politicians because, and the term he used was, they controlled the files. Well, you could look at that literally, but what he really meant was that they controlled information and their whole work lives were devoted to understanding what was going on, while politicians could only do that part-time because so much of the rest of their lives was spent doing something else. So the bureaucrats have a certain advantage over politicians. Now, you hear people who are anti-government and neoliberal seeing bureaucrats as nothing but holding things back, but in fact, I think that often as not, bureaucrats are progressive and are pushing things forward in many kinds of ways. Now, planners who are government planners are located within bureaucracies. If they have the concept of the just city and producing just outcomes as their aims, then they can in fact produce better results or more progressive results. So one of the things I've really tried to do as an educator, as a lecturer in a lot of different venues actually, is to constantly promote the ideas, both the policies that make cities more just and simply the idea that what city government is supposed to do is not simply to produce economic development, but rather to produce greater justice, and that means programs which are redistributional, not simply oriented toward growth. Well, let me backtrack a little. When I was an undergraduate, which was at Harvard, there was not one single female professor who was tenured except for one person who occupied a chair that had to be a woman. And she happened to be in astronomy, so that didn't affect me particularly. So there were no women who had professorial titles in the government department. When I did my master's degree at BU, there was one woman. And then when I did my PhD at MIT, I think again there were none, or there were none who I took courses with, but I don't think there were tenured women anyhow. So then I was in the job market, and I was offered a job at Rutgers in urban planning, which was sort of happenstance. I had been doing some consulting for actually a woman professor at Queens College while working on my thesis, and another woman who was working for her also was teaching at Rutgers and said, well, Susan, are you interested in teaching urban planning? And I said, well, I had never really considered it, but sure, here's my CV. At that time, there was no regularized job market. She just gave my CV to the chair. He talked to me for an hour and offered me a job. That was it. There was none of this business with job talks and advertising and all that kind of thing. So I started teaching urban planning, and there was one other woman in the whole department, and all the rest, I guess there were 10 men and 2 women. I think I was more informal and more open to students than many of the men. I loved teaching. I really was very happy, and I was very happy having become an urban planner because it really allowed me to do research on whatever I felt like rather than being forced into the cubbyholes that political scientists have to go in. Urban planning is predominantly a graduate program. I did teach undergraduates in one large lecture course, but otherwise entirely graduate students, which allowed me to work with them. Then what I actually really have liked the best in all my teaching is supervising doctoral dissertations, and I've supervised a whole lot. I've never actually counted them, but it's certainly, well, it's probably about 40. And I'm on even, another bunch of PhD thesis committees too. I like working one-on-one. I like helping guide theses, but also it's acquainted me with a huge range of subject matter because the student is, of course, the expert on whatever it is. And so I've supervised theses on China, on India, on all different parts of the world, which I personally have never done research in. And since I do consider myself a comparativist, it did give me insights. I guess one thing I didn't talk about before when talking about my intellectual trajectory, and maybe this is a digression here, but that I early on felt that just looking at the United States was too narrow. And so I actually asked a student who came from the Netherlands about European cities worth studying in terms of urban policy. And he said, oh, well, come to Amsterdam. My family lives there. They'll introduce you to everyone. And so that's how I started studying Amsterdam. Then I also studied London and to some extent looked at other European cities as well. And so having that framework then enabled me to say, and this is one of the reasons why I think that David Harvey paints too broad a brush when talking about capitalism, is that we can see different capitalist countries which have different levels of support for their citizens, and that it is possible to be both capitalist and much more egalitarian than is the case in American cities. So having that framework was very helpful to me to eventually get to attempting in my final book, The Just City, to both develop a theoretical apparatus having to do with what is the meaning of justice, and then more specifically, how to do the policies in particular cities, and I looked at London, Amsterdam, and New York, carry out the aims of a just city, and from looking at them, what kinds of policies can we glean that would provide basis for urban planners to create more just cities.